It's a great honor to be here in Croatia finally. I just arrived last night, and I've been wanting to come to Croatia for a very long time. Great blessing to be here. We'll start with another prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus Repletorum Corde Fidelium, et tui amoris in eis inium accende, emite spiritum tuum et creabuntur, et renovabis faciem terrae. Oremus Deus qui Corde Fidelium Sancti Spiritus, illustratione docuistida nobis eneodum spiritu rectus sapere, et Deus semper consolatione gaudere per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So maybe if I start talking too fast, give me one of these and I'll slow it down. Or maybe this means you're not doing very good. Maybe go do one of these, slow it down, if you're going to tell me that the translator is not keeping up with me. So I'll try to talk at a pace where the translator can translate into Croatian, but do some symbol if that translator, who is very good when I was just listening now, if I'm going a little bit too fast at that moment. On no other topic do conservative Catholics disagree with traditional Catholics than on the topic of the social reign of Christ the King. Many times in my country, and maybe in your country too, every time in the Novus Ordo calendar it comes up, the feast of Christ the King, you will hear a decent priest, maybe not a liberal, maybe not a traditionalist, but a decent priest will say, Christ has to be king of your heart. And they're absolutely right. Christ should be king of your heart, of everyone in your family's heart, and in the whole world. But what most conservative, non-traditional priests fail to mention is that Christ is also the king of every nation. Christ is the king of Croatia. Christ is the king of the United States. Christ is even king of places that have very few people that might recognize him as king, like Mongolia. And so today I want to talk entirely about Christ today, but it's worth a little bit more introduction than what Ivan just gave me, and it's because I didn't fully believe in the social reign of Christ the King growing up, or rather, it was never taught to me. So let me spend a very short time on my own conversion. As Ivan said, I was raised in an environment where I went to Jesuit schools. And I don't know about the Balkan lands, but in my country, the Jesuits are known as the most progressive of all Catholics. And so I was raised somewhat of a social justice warrior. Having gone to a Jesuit high school and a Jesuit university, my view of Catholicism growing up was quite liberal, quite leftist. Maybe I could even say a bit communist at the time. However, around the age of 16 or 17, I had a conversion to pretty mainstream Catholicism. I was not a traditionalist yet, but I did have a conversion to EWTN, Mother Angelica style Catholicism. I became someone who believed in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I became a very pro-life Catholic, even though I wouldn't attend my first Latin Mass for many, many more years, much less offer it for many more years. As I said, on no other topic in the Catholic Church does the pre-Vatican II Catholic disagree with the post-Vatican II Catholic than on the social reign of Christ the King. As I said, many people will admit Christ is king of our hearts, but who will admit Christ is king of all the nations? As we speak about this, there's a few things to set the stage, few things to put on the back burner. The first is this: when you hear me talk about the social reign of Christ the King, and I'm sure most of you know this, please know the Catholic Church has never encouraged forced conversions. When we speak of the union of church and state, we don't mean those are united in function, but we do mean the church is called to intervene in matters of the state so as to save as many souls as possible. But that has never meant forced conversions. In my country, there is a rumor that we believe in the separation of church and state. But amazingly, most Americans do not know that the notion of the separation of church and state is not in our Constitution. It's not even in the Bill of Rights. It was simply a letter Jefferson wrote to a group of Christians promising them the state would not involve themselves in the church. Not a promise the church would not be involved in the issues of the state. Now that's very important because any Catholic who believes in the social reign of Christ the King rejects the separation of church and state, if you can believe it. We actually reject that. Now here we are in Croatia. As I said, a great joy to be with you. And the bishop whose place I took was actually placed by Trump on the United States Religious Liberty Commission. He's on the Religious Liberty Commission. Vatican II promotes religious freedom, also called religious liberty, but the Catholic Church has always rejected religious liberty and religious freedom. Why? Well, it sounds like a good thing, especially after so many martyrs. Your country has had hundreds of thousands of martyrs, people killed by communism, so you might be tempted to say, we believe in religious freedom. We want religious freedom. But here's why the Catholic Church has always rejected that. You see, God tolerates false religions, and so does the Catholic Church, which is one reason why the Catholic Church has always rejected forced conversions. But God cannot give you a positive right to go to hell. Why? Because Jesus Christ came to save you and to save every nation. Now, some people might say to this, yes, Father Nix, but the state should still give rights for religious freedom. And that is exactly where they make their mistake. The fact is this: the state can give you no rights. Let me say that again. The state can give you no rights. Why? Because all of your rights come from God. All of your rights come from God. And that is why Catholics who accept the social reign of Christ the King must reject religious liberty, even as found in Vatican II, or even the American Commission that the American bishop whose place I took at this conference was unfortunately going to promote before you. Another American topic, very specific to my country, but one that we've unfortunately bled to the whole rest of the world, is the difference between freedom and license. Those words are so similar, I hope your Croatian translator had two different words for them. Freedom and license. So let me explain a little bit of the difference between that. I don't play piano. If I were to sit down at a piano and try to read music, I might be able to bang some discordant sounds out. Does that mean I'm following freedom? In some sense, I'm free to bang on the piano, but I'm not free to play beautiful music. Why not? Because I don't know how to play beautiful music. So I can choose to play or not play, but banging is not music. So also a country can aim at freedom, but if the natural law and divine revelation are not at the center of it, it will only be banging in rebellion. So also when we divert from the natural law and divine revelation, not only will men and women divert from order, the entire state will divert from order. Let me tell you about a podcast that happened in my country several years ago. It was under the time of COVID. Someone last night called it the plandemic. I call it the scamdemic. And it was about 5 years ago between two famous conservatives in my country. One is Dave Rubin. He is a gay libertarian Jew. I don't say that as an insult. He would agree with all three of those adjectives. Dave Rubin, a gay libertarian Jew. And then Michael Knowles, who is a traditional Catholic. And they had a very interesting debate on libertarianism. Now, many conservatives who are not traditionalists in my country are libertarian, meaning they very much believe in a philosophy of live and let live. Let everyone do their thing. Now, even I will admit that is better than communists taking away our First Amendment, which is our right to express ourselves freely. It's essentially, if you line this up with theology, it's a freedom of conscience. However, this libertarian notion is key to understanding the American misunderstanding of freedom that delves into license. This was just the time Mr. Knowles had come out with his book called Speechless, where he shows the pitfalls of the American view of free speech. In this podcast between Dave Rubin and Mr. Michael Knowles, Knowles showed that in the 1960s in the United States, conservatives got tricked, or conservatives got deceived by liberals into thinking they should pull Christian prayer from public schools. Why? Once again, because of this notion of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And what Michael Knowles shows in that book in Speechless is that conservatives lost all their rights once we agreed liberals had equal rights to us. Conservatives lost nearly all rights once we agreed liberals had equal rights. And what this created was a power vacuum. What happened in the United States in the 60s and 70s is a power vacuum on thought and word and the education of our children. Knowles used the example of grade school mathematics. You can't just teach rules. You have to teach mathematical rules plus actual math problems. So also you can't just say, let's have values we all agree on. You need an overarching belief system. You see, even though my country was never Catholic, it was always Protestant, we can say that it was Christian in its roots. And at one point, Christians, both Catholics and Protestants, decided to put religious liberty ahead of Christian dogma. And once this happened, we actually agreed to allow leftists to take over the minds of men and women and children in our country. Why? Again, this was the power vacuum. And that is why it's probably too late for Trump's Religious Liberty Commission. I think I still like Trump more than most traditional Catholics in my country do, but even I will admit the notion of a Religious Liberty Commission is too late. Conservatives already gave over the space in the public forum where they agreed to the separation of church and state, something that the Catholic Church has always rejected. Speaking of podcasts, my friend Father Chad Ripperger was just on the Sean Ryan podcast, an enormous podcast in the United States. And one of the things he's mentioned, that he has mentioned before, is here in Europe, in Switzerland, maybe you know this, maybe you've heard Father Ripperger's talks, but several years ago, they opened an enormous tunnel. It connected two areas of transportation, and the state had a huge tunnel that was dug, bored out, and they had so many heads of state that came to this that they decided to have a religious ritual. And the person they honored, or I should say, the spirit honored in the opening of this tunnel in Switzerland was the demon named Baphomet. A demon named Baphomet. Do you see why I mentioned the power vacuum? When Christ is not king, states will literally enthrone demons by their actual names. There's no such thing as meeting halfway. Some spirit will always fill the power vacuum. And if it's not Christ as king, Satan will be king of the country. You saw this in Croatia for so long. When the communists overturned the Catholic faith, what is the official religion of communism? It's atheism. But who's really behind that? It's Satan. There's no such thing as a middle ground between the social reign of Christ the King and free speech. Pope Pius XI said on this topic of Christ the King, nations will be reminded by the annual celebration of this feast that not only private individuals, but also rulers and princes are bound to give public honor and obedience to Christ. It will call to their minds the thought of the last judgment, wherein Christ, who has been cast out of public life, despised, neglected, and ignored, will most severely avenge these insults. For his kingly dignity demands that the state should take account of the commandments of God and of Christian principles, both in making laws and administering justice, and also in providing for the young a sound moral education. That's Quas Primus 32. I have a friend back in Denver, Colorado. He is a Catholic civil attorney, and he goes by the pen name and the YouTube name Catholic Esquire. Esquire just means civil attorney. So I'm going to refer to him, even though we actually graduated high school together, so I know his first and last name and I know him well, but he goes by a pen name that we'll just call Esquire, and he writes this. This means that Christ demands we follow his commandments in our personal lives as well as upholding the divine and natural laws in civil affairs, no matter how unpopular or countercultural those positions may be. Think again of Michael Knowles, showing we need some overarching theory, some overarching, slow down? Is that what that means? Slow down? Okay. Some overarching theory, or we are going to slip into a different spirit ruling us. I only got this invite to speak about 5 days ago, and so we put it together pretty quickly for me to come. And a very kind civil attorney from Croatia drove me from the airport to the hotel last night, and he gave me a history of Croatia I didn't know. I knew of your history fighting communists, but I did not realize a pope in the Middle Ages gave you guys the name of the bulwark of Christianity. That's because you fought the Muslims for 500 years here. So you fought 50 years against the communists and 500 years against the Muslims. Right between getting the phone call from Ivan and this drive last night, here in Croatia, a very kind but mistaken traditional Croatian priest called me to try to talk me out of coming to the conference. He told me not to come. He told me this endangers the Latin Mass here because of the alleged disobedience of this conference organizers to the highest authorities in the church. But here's where that kind but mistaken traditional priest went wrong. You see, the heretics who, quote, allow you to have the Latin Mass, well, they don't have the authority to stop you from attending the Latin Mass. Under the authority of Christ the King, you don't need anyone's permission to be Catholic. Under the authority of Christ the King, you do not need anyone's permission to be Catholic. So why listen to such fear-based heretics? Because even certain weak traditionalists are afraid to name them as heretics. And heretics have, according to all the doctors of the church, lost their authority under Christ the King. So where do those weak conservatives go from here? Well, those fear-based conservatives say they insist the average layperson does not have the ability to recognize a heretic in the putative hierarchy. Why did they do that? Simply for one reason. Because these weak traditionalists and weak conservatives are too afraid to fight the heretics. It all comes down to fear. And by the way, they are wrong. Numerous saints of the Catholic Church say a layperson like you, and some of you priests, you have the right and even the duty to avoid a heretic in the alleged hierarchy of the Catholic Church. But as I said, here in Croatia, you have a glorious history of avoiding all fear. How you fought the communists, how you fought the Muslims for 500 years. Why live in any fear in a country gilded with the grace of the blood of Jesus that is poured upon this glorious country for so long? You, of all people, have nothing to fear here in Croatia. But where are we now? We have quite an uphill battle in the church. Last year, my friend the Esquire wrote this article called Why Modernists Hate the Feast of Christ the King. And I'm going to read you a couple sentences from that. With synodality now in full implementation mode, Leo, the modernists, and the post-conciliar church utterly refuse to submit to Christ the King. We are now in a total state of post-conciliar non serviam. Instead, we are told to submit to feminist empowerment, mankind's infinite dignity, Mother Earth, the LGBTQ agenda, the suppression of the sacrifice of the Holy Mass. Submit to anything you want, the modernists say, just not our Lord. Well, since my friend the Esquire wrote that, it actually got worse since then. Just 2 weeks ago, you-know-who in Rome will keep us out of more trouble by just saying you-know-who. You-know-who in Rome received a delegation from the Ecumenical World Council of Churches, which included a German lay bishop named Heinrich, an Armenian archbishop named Viken, a Baptist preacher named Merlin, and a Protestant preacher named Jerry. And you-know-who said we need to see, quote, the need for visible Christian unity, recognizing the challenges this presents even within the Roman Catholic Church due to the existence of different and diverse views, affirming while our task is not to build a Christendom yet, Christians must work together in unity to heal and restore the world, end quote. Do you realize how diabolical it is to say we Catholics are not called to build Christendom? That's not distasteful. It's actually diabolical. But our call to follow Christ the King is not just something that's medieval. The notion of Christ reigning over society goes back to the early church. In fact, this starts from our very Lord Jesus Christ. Many Christians in the world today, because we are so influenced by Protestants, only think of the individual human. But did you know Christ commanded all of us, but especially bishops, apostles, and priests, not just to preach to individuals, but to preach to all nations, because all nations belong to Jesus Christ. Matthew 28, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. You see, Christ is already King of all the nations, whether they recognize him or not. Pope Gelasius, in the year 494, he wrote something frequently called the two swords. Remember when Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane had two swords? Some people have interpreted those two swords when Christ says, it is enough. One of those two swords is the spiritual power of the Catholic Church for spiritual warfare, for exorcism, and for protection. And the other sword is the sword of the Catholic state to defend against intruders. And so Pope Gelasius in 494 wrote this to the Emperor Anastasius. He wrote, "There are two powers, august Emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is the more weighty, since they have to render an account for even the kings of men in the divine judgment. You are also aware, dear son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over humankind, yet in things divine you bow your head humbly before the leaders of the clergy and await from their hands the means of your salvation. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly mysteries, you recognize that you should be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order, and that in these matters you depend on their judgment rather than wish to force them to follow your will." Can you imagine if the Archbishop whose place I took, who's on Trump's Religious Liberty Board, can you imagine if he made a public statement to him saying, "You are also aware, dear son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over the United States, yet in things divine you bow your head humbly before the leaders of the clergy and await from their hands the means of your salvation"? Can you imagine any bishop in the world, besides maybe Archbishop Vigano, speaking like that to a world leader? Yet this is from the 5th century. This was from the early church, not the medieval ages. So this goes way, way back, the notion of the social reign of Christ the King. St. Augustine wrote, "For the happiness of the state has no other source than the happiness of man, since the state is merely a unified group of men." And so we must intervene. The Catholic Church must intervene in matters of the state. One group that I'm involved in the United States is called Red Rose Rescue, and though I usually go every week or every month to pray peacefully in front of the third largest abortion center in the United States, actually what we have in Denver is the third largest abortion center in the whole world. I go there every week or every other week to pray, to do exorcism prayer. But I also work for a group called Red Rose Rescue, where sometimes we go inside the abortion centers where we pray. We are never violent, but we pray inside the abortion centers. And when the staff says, "You must leave," we say to the staff, "I cannot leave until every child and every woman is safe." Inevitably, they call the police on us. When the police show up, they tell us to leave, and we say, from inside the abortion center, not outside, we are inside the abortion center, and we say, "We cannot leave until every child is safe and every baby is safe." And unfortunately, we then get arrested and we go to jail. So I've been arrested and in jail in New Jersey and in Washington, D.C. This is what it means to interfere. Even some pro-lifers say, you must follow the law. But as you know, St. Thomas Aquinas teaches a bad law is no law at all. So we in Red Rose Rescue, when we are arrested inside of an abortion center, we are intervening in the illegal activity of the state. We are Catholic priests intervening in the unjust killing of children. Are we breaking the law? No, because there is no law telling us that we must stop killing, we must stop the killing of children. Why? Because an unjust law is no law at all. But you see, the modernists don't want this. Many modernists will give a little hat tip to the end of abortion, but ultimately they do not want to be under the authority of Christ the King. The Esquire writes this: "We will see that the modernist hates the feast of Christ the King, because in their arrogance and pride, they believe they are above the authority of Christ and the deposit of the faith. Pope Paul VI changed the feast because the modernists do not believe real Catholicism has anything to contribute to the way society is governed. In fact, it hinders mankind's progress, they think. They believe the will of man is the sole guiding principle for how society, government, and politics should operate. I think the most pronounced example we have of this is what happened in COVID. As you know, under COVID, we had a flu with a 99.92% survival rate. Now, before this, the Catholic Church had never closed her churches, even in the catacombs of the Roman persecutions. We had never stopped the sacraments for the bubonic plague. You didn't even stop the sacraments as you were fighting the Muslims for 500 years. You didn't stop the sacraments in your time of fighting the communists, even though they tortured and killed thousands of your priests. But in 2,000 years, the Catholic Church closed their churches for a flu with a 99.92% survival rate. That's because the state took over the decisions of the church. And why is that? It's because we relinquished those rights by rejecting the social reign of Christ the King. Do you see why this isn't just pie in the sky? The notion of the social reign of Christ the King, many Catholics think this is just an intellectual exercise, living in a time warp, wishing we lived in medieval days with a king and a nice castle. But this affected your life. Because we rejected the social reign of Christ the King, we let all of our churches be closed. How many older folks died without the sacraments because of this game? The Esquire writes this: "We have seen this play out with glaring examples just over the past few years with the rise of the Great Reset and COVIDism, as the Vatican and the world's bishops surrendered their authority and duty to protect the sacrifice of the Holy Mass to global elites and their politicians. We see a shining example of this when the same hierarchy shamed and forced faithful Catholics into injecting their bodies with abortion-tainted poisons to avoid conflict with secular ideals. We saw parish priests forcibly remove pregnant mothers from Mass and refuse sacraments to the faithful in effort to comply with health department requirements and an evil CDC political agenda. There are so many other examples," he writes. So the reason I asked Yvonne to call this speech "Christendom Saves More Souls" is so that you understand this notion of this notion of the social reign of Christ the King is not a philosophical exercise. Croatia is Catholic today because you took it to the streets to fight the Muslims, and the Catholic Church supported that. You would be speaking Arabic right now if you didn't believe in the social reign of Christ the King. In fact, the lawyer who picked me up last night told me the enormous role Croatians played in the Battle of Lepanto. Perhaps we could say all of Europe would be speaking Arabic right now if it were not for the Croatians who fought at Lepanto. This is because of the two swords. In the prayers of deliverance that I do, I bring spiritual protection to you, but you are called to bring physical protection to me as a priest. And the overturning of the social reign of Christ the King has neutered the second sword, and in fact, modernism has neutered the first sword. As you know, there's a lot of talk in the traditional world about the third secret of Fatima. When I heard Mary, or rather when I first heard the description of Mary talking about the errors of Russia, I thought that was purely economic. When I heard of Fatima, or studied Fatima in my 20s, and heard this topic, the errors of Russia, I thought that was purely economic. Now, however, I realize the error of Russia is any time you replace God with the state. The error of Russia is replacing God with the state. And this is why the heresy of modernism is so intensely linked to Marxism. Yet now we are so far gone in the Catholic Church that modernism is completely normalized in the Catholic Church. There's a KGB defector, someone who came from Russia to the United States, to warn Americans in the 1980s how bad communism was going to be. Many of you know him, or at least know of him, Yuri Bezmenov. And Yuri Bezmenov came to the United States in the early 80s to say, you are already half communist because of your own overturning of morality in this country. You are soon to be communist in your country. He said this to us in the early 1980s. And the final stage the communists and the modernists need to achieve is normalization. The normalization of evil. I think we can say the same about most Catholics now. They have reached this stage of normalization because they are unable to fight modernism in the Catholic Church. An Indian named Raj Pant, at a site called Medium, explained Bezmenov's final stage of communism stopping people from fighting, namely normalization. And so as I read you a few sentences from this Indian describing the Russian, I want you to think specifically of the Catholic Church and how many people are fighting modernism. Rajpant writes, the final stage of normalization, where the previously subverted ideology becomes the new norm. The final stage is normalization, where the previously subverted ideology becomes the new norm. Bezmenov emphasized that this phase is not about a return to stability, but rather the establishment of a new societal order based on the foreign ideology. The once targeted society is now reshaped according to the infiltrating force's vision, erasing its original cultural identity and values. Normalization solidifies the control of the foreign ideology, and the population may no longer resist as the altered reality becomes accepted and internalized. The society is transformed, and the process of ideological subversion is complete. Yuri Bezmenov's insights into the stages of ideological subversion remain relevant, serving as a cautionary reminder of the importance of preserving our history. Did modernism begin at Vatican II? No, it did not, but it normalized it. But now, since 2013, it has been especially normalized in the Catholic Church. And now that we have had so few Catholics fight for the traditional faith and liturgy over the last 60 years, it has created a new societal order, an order that no longer believes in Christ the King. As that author stated, this leads to an altered reality and one that has unfortunately become internalized. You see, the social reign of Christ the King is reality. Christ is King of Croatia, whether Croatians recognize him or not. Christ is King of the United States, whether Americans recognize him or not. But our admission of him and our cooperation with his full rights as God and man who merited all of this, that determines the number of souls that will make it to heaven. When we stop admitting, notice I don't say recognizing, when we stop admitting that Christ is King, we start pushing for religious liberty or religious freedom. But error has no rights. Why? Because God can't lead you to error, and your rights never came from man. Your rights came from God, who only gives you a right to be a Catholic, not a Muslim, not a Hindu, not a Jew, not an atheist, not a worshiper of Baphomet. God might tolerate that on earth, but at the positive level, God only gives you the right to be Catholic. You can reject that right and go to hell, but you cannot say a new religion will get you to heaven. The great diabolical deceit is leftists saying they have just as much of a right as Christians to educate your children. And yet, those same leftists never believed in some type of fair gain once they gained free speech. When they wanted equal rights to the minds of your children in communism in your country, in the 60s and 70s in my country, they knew it would create a power vacuum. They knew it would create a separation of church and state. And they knew if Christ was kicked out, Satan would take his place. Not a happy middle ground of warm values and discussion, the words we hear from the Vatican all the time, accompaniment and dialogue. When you kick Christ out of society, Satan moves in. And once Christians admitted Christ is the only king of Christians and not king of whole states, do you know who moved into that vacuum where Christ once reigned? Baphomet, as you see right here in Europe. Yesterday on the airplane, I ended up in a 2-hour conversation with an American evangelist who travels the world sharing the gospel with all kinds of non-believers. They start home churches. You and I know there's only one church. It's the Catholic Church. But usually when I end up talking to Protestants on airplanes, I do quite a bit of preaching or apologetics, but this time I actually listen quite a bit. And he told me, for example, some of his friends converted a gentleman in Morocco Tunisia. He converted a man in Tunisia from Islam to Christianity, and they brought this man to prison, and they knocked all of his teeth out in prison. And when he got out of prison, he had to go to a dentist, and his testimony was so powerful, his dentist even converted. And so he was seeing all these conversions. And as I started thinking about my talk and my conversation with this American evangelist who's sharing the gospel all over the world, it hit me, if a Protestant with only 2 sacraments is sharing the gospel with this much courage, what are we so afraid of as Catholics? Why are we afraid to fight for Christ the King if a Protestant can convert someone to have all their teeth knocked out? What are we so afraid of? As I said, you don't need anyone's permission to be Catholic. And so where do we go from here? 1, be not afraid and share the faith. You and I cannot, at the social level, put the great monarch on some throne. We can't produce a traditional pope, but we can pray for those days, and until then, we can evangelize. And secondly, on this topic of the 2 swords, realize that even though there are not groups like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller anymore, there are groups of mercenaries who are rescuing children from child sex slavery even today. My friend is friends with men in Spain who go from Spain to Africa to, for example, rescue little teenage girls who are Christians from the hands of Boko Haram in Nigeria, and they succeed. Sometimes they have to kill those who would rape children, but they succeed in rescuing those children. And so realize not everything the media tells you is true, and also there are many true things that is not in the media. Because those mercenaries will never get the approval of, say, the president of Spain or the bishops of Spain, they've decided that's not going to stop them. They are still going with automatic weapons to rescue children in slavery from Africa. I'm not saying that's what you have to do, but I'm saying God had you born in the 20th and 21st century to still go do heroic things that Catholics in the past have done. Get creative. It doesn't have to be a mercenary with a machine gun. But somehow, for some reason, you were born 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, to live now and to evangelize as many people as possible to either get the world ready for Christ's glorious return or the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Whether those are one in this, we know the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary is coming. Whether they're one and the same at the same time, or we get this great era of peace, the great Pope, the great monarch, you can get the world ready for that through your prayer, your fasting, your sacrifice, and your evangelization. Last night, for some reason, we couldn't remember the name of one of America's greatest Catholic martyrs of the last 100 years. By America, I include Mexico. Last night at dinner, we didn't get to eat till like 9 or 10 p.m., and David's of Mexican extraction. I'm of Irish. There's actually a lot of crossover there. And one of our heroes is a 12-year-old martyr, and for some reason, we couldn't think of the name Jose Luis Joselito Sanchez del Rio. And I think it's because, well, 1, it was tired, 2, we were drinking wine, but maybe 3, it was so that I could Google him this morning and be refreshed of his memory. If you've seen the movie For Greater Glory, you see quite an accurate representation of what happens. Jose Luis is told to renounce Christ as king, and he will not. As a 12-year-old boy, he will not renounce Christ as king. And they say, if you do not reject Christ, we will cut the soles of your feet off and make you walk to your own grave, dig it, then we will shoot you and kill you. He would not deny him. And so they did it. They cut the soles of his feet off. He called on Jesus and Mary the whole time. He walked to his own grave. And his final words was, Viva Cristo Rey. Long live Christ the King. And even though we are undergoing a white martyrdom, not a red martyrdom, that must be your war cry going forward. Viva Cristo Rey.
Zahvalio bi se pateru Nixu na ovom ovako inspirativnom predavanju i mislim kako za 3 dana je pripreme ovo, mislim ovako fantastično predavanje i sada evo imate prilike da postavite pitanja izravno njemu i on će odgovoriti rado. Evo, izvolite, dajem vam riječ.
Hvala Isus kao prvo.
Navijeke.
Pitanje, budući da je dobar, mislim da je poznavac dobar američke situacije u samoj državi Americi, mene zanima podjela katolika u državi Americi na one koji podržavaju Trumpa i one koje ne podržavaju Trumpa. Primijetio sam to često velike sukobe između čak i dobrih katolika, ajmo reći. Pa me zanima vaše mišljenje o tome.
So I voted for Trump twice, and why many traditional Catholics have turned against Trump in the last 2 years is a few reasons. One of those reasons is he hasn't exactly walked back his original view of being for IVF, in vitro fertilization. Might take a minute to have the different abbreviation of that in Croatian. IVF, in vitro fertilization. So many Catholics are rightfully upset with Trump on promoting in vitro fertilization. A newer issue that has become a very hot button topic for American conservatives and American traditionalists is the war with Iran. And most specifically, the question is Israel influencing Trump to be bombing Iran? There are some theories that because his son-in-law is Jewish, that the attack against Iran might be instigated by the country of Israel. And so many American Catholics are rightfully questioning Trump right now because many conservatives in my country have only in the last year switched support from Israel to Palestine. In fact, that's not just a Catholic thing. I looked at a secular statistic just a week ago that shows that the amount of supporters of Palestine in my country is now equal to Israel. I'm not saying my view on this whole thing, I'm just saying a fact. It's about 50-50, where only 5 years ago, it would have been 95% support of Israel and 5% support of Palestine. But Trump is an old school conservative, not a traditionalist, and so he's happy to support Israel, and many of his base of voters have turned against him because of this. Now, I wish Trump had not gone to war, because one of the reasons I voted for him was he promised us no more wars. And he actually fulfilled that promise in his first term as president. However, the reason why I said in my talk I'm probably the traditionalist who least dislikes Trump right now is because I always remember how much worse it would be if we had had Kamala Harris as president. We Catholics would be in prison by now. We would be in gulags like Croatia experienced in the 1980s. So I'm not saying Trump is some saint. I hope he's not influenced by Israel. I wish we weren't at war. I wish he was not for IVF. But I still can't help but believe it's better than if Kamala Harris was president.
I will add just a few other thoughts. As an American, I sympathize very much with what Father Nix said. I agree with it, but I would add a little more. I'm not sure how the political system works in Croatia. For example, I grew up in Germany, in part. And in Germany, there are more than just two political parties. There are several, and they usually have an election, and then on any particular election, the two with the most votes or the three with the most votes actually get a runoff. And so candidates can stand for positions a little bit more strongly because of the wider diversity of parties. So I don't know Croatia's situation. Maybe I learned this weekend. But in the United States, it is very unfortunate that we only have two parties. And that is a big disadvantage. I would like to see that changed, but it's not our history. I think we're stuck with it for now. And that's why what Father Nix says at the end is so important, because we were faced with a choice, I think, of an evil and a much greater evil. And so Trump was the evil and Kamala was the greater evil. And therefore, Catholics will support Trump because they believe he will cause less evil than the other side. And I think that is true. The one other thing, though, about Trump that has me very concerned personally, and many Catholics and many non-Catholics, is he is also increasing the federal power of our country to centralize it. And so, as Catholics, we believe in a principle called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. It means in any society, the smallest group that can effectively deal with the matter should. So a family, very small unit, if the family can raise their children, they are responsible for it. And all the other levels of society and government must help that unit do their job well. So we are, in the United States, we would like to see subsidiarity. I think our country was founded on it, a very sort of independent spirit, stronger families, but that is changing. And now, instead of having more local government or even state government, we have a very, very big and powerful central federal government that wants to control all aspects of our life. And this, it is communism, basically. And I see Trump doing a lot of things that are advancing that. Artificial intelligence, with his fiscal, economic policies, with increased police powers. And so it's very concerning because we don't know how to stop it.
My name is Sister Maria. My name is Maria Dolcom.
And
I follow.
molim vas na hrvatskom.
Oh, sorry. Ja pratim svih troje vas. At Fan John Henry. America or United States of America još uvijek imaju a freedom of speech. So you can say, oh, sorry, I'm opposite, možda. Još uvijek ima slobodu govora, za razliku od, ja barem osjećam, od mnogih evropskih zemalja. Ja sam živjela mnogo godina i radila u Ujedinjenom kraljevstvu. I, nažalost, u zadnjih, ajmo reći, 5-6 godina, nema slobode govora. Ali moje pitanje je, i zapravo razgovarajući sa mnogim mladim ljudima u Hrvatskoj, ljudi su upoznati šta se dešava u Americi, mladi ljudi. I znamo za CERN, znamo za tunel, znamo za olimpijske igre, za Baphomet, za Mammon, za sve te bogove. Ljudi su više upoznati, možda nisu na ovoj konferenciji, ali zna se za to. Ali moje pitanje je vezano za te convert Catholics koji se na neki način pojavljuju hajmo reći, u United States of America, koji nisu, barem se meni čini, tradicionalni. Na primjer, J.D. Vance. Pa onda imamo Epic Hug, Erika Kirk i J.D. Vance, što nije na neki način katoličko. Moje pitanje je, da li tu ima nekakva, možda, conspiracy teorija, možda je, da li tu postoji neka agenda da se iskoristi katolička religija u neke druge svrhe? Zapravo oni se meni ne čini tradicionalno katolici. Tu bi rado izdvojila, ajmo reći, Scott Hahn, Dr. Taylor Marshall, to su katolici koji podučavaju i tako dalje, ali čini bi se da tu nešto nije mi ok, ajmo reći tako. Pa eto, htjela bih pitati vas za mišljenje. Ne znam da li je moje pitanje jasno.
I think so. Let me try answering, and then if this doesn't answer your question, because I heard about 5 different questions in there, and that's okay. That's how I ask questions also. But I think I'll go for the last one, and maybe I'll give the statistical. I'll start with the boring statistics and then try to answer the other questions. So there are a lot of young converts to mainstream parishes in the United States today. Your concern is rightly placed. Your concern is well spoken, because for every convert into a mainstream Novus Ordo parish in the United States, 8.5 people leave. For every convert, 8.5 Catholics leave. So right now, there is a lot of excitement about the people coming into the Catholic Church, but I'm wondering what they're actually learning in their education as candidates or catechumens. For example, the majority of American Catholics believe there's no problem with gay marriage. That's not an exaggeration. literally the majority of American Catholics are fine with gay marriage. And the amount of married Catholic couples using contraception is over 80%. So what are they teaching these young people coming into the church? I honestly don't know. I don't know if the young people entering the church are liberals or conservatives or traditionalists. However, here's the good news. Even post traditionis custodes, even following the new rules, once again, unjust rules against the Latin Mass coming from the Vatican, there's a statistician named T.L.M. Ryan, and T.L.M. Ryan has proven that by the year 2098, the traditional Latin Mass in the United States will have more adherents than the Novus Ordo parishes at the current rate. And I think for countries like France, that's in the year probably 2030. So even though I don't know the faith of many of the young converts, I do know that for the United States and Europe, the traditional Latin Mass is growing much, much faster than the Novus Ordo parishes. And one reason for this is we in the traditional movement are not bleeding 8.5 people for every convert. There are some people leaving the traditional movement. There's probably parents in this room who go to Latin Mass who've had some children leave the Catholic faith. I'm not saying it's 100% retention rate. However, we are not losing people at the rate of 8.5 to every convert. And because traditionalists in my country do not contracept, the Latin Mass is growing simply by birth rate. So there's some good news in all of that. The fact that the traditional movement is growing very much despite the rules against it. And then the sad news is that for every convert to the mainstream Catholic Church, 8.5 leave the church. Does that answer the question?
Hvala. Evo, odite, možemo dalje. Imamo vremena za još jedno pitanje. Mr. Chen. He will speak English because his English is better than Croatian. So that's fine.
Then I'll translate it to Croatian for
Well, in the USA, some of the Catholic podcasters and converts like Candace Owens, Carrie Prijambola, and Nick Fuentes, they are somewhat popular in the traditional Catholic world since they have more independent opinions on the Zionist question. But what do they think of social kingship of Christ? Are they in favor of Catholicism as state religion, etc.?
Sure, I'll go in order. I can't speak for those three, but I know John Henry's interviewed at least one of them. I'll give my best guess as to what those three believe on the social reign of Christ the King. I believe Carrie probably doesn't know the teaching since she talks a lot about religious freedom and religious liberty. Candace, as a new Catholic, probably does. And the reason I think Candace probably does is because she goes to the Latin Mass. And then Nick Fuentes is an odd duck because he's promoting his own view of the social reign of Christ the King. I don't think Nick Fuentes knows what the social reign of Christ the King is, but he does want a Christian nation. So I don't think he's really studied the true teaching of it, but he's accidentally, and I'm not a big fan of Nick Fuentes, but I'll give him this, that he's kind of stumbled on the notion that Christendom was allowed to have a military and have a physical force. I'll let him jump in real quick. Let me say one more thing that ties into her question earlier. I think one of the difficulties for traditionalists is because we do reject religious freedom and religious liberty. Under COVID, I was one of the loudest voices of all priests in the world speaking against the shutdown of churches. I was one of the loudest voices speaking against the vaccine. And because many people in church and state tried to silence me, I said, hey, I believe in free speech. And then traditional Latin Mass Catholics would say, no, 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 you can't say you believe in free speech because we traditionalists don't believe in free speech. So I thought, okay, how do I defend myself? And one of the terms I found in pre-Vatican II documents is freedom of conscience. Now that doesn't mean you get to decide what's right and wrong, but what I'll use is the term freedom of conscience in place of freedom of speech. And another good replacement is, at least in my country, First Amendment in place perhaps of religious liberty. See, the First Amendment in my country, and this ties into your question, ma'am, why America is still better than Europe when it comes down to Christians still having rights, even if we want to avoid terms like freedom of speech. And I'm not even convinced we have to necessarily avoid that. But let's pretend like we have to avoid the term freedom of speech. We still in our country have the First Amendment, which is a really, really great advantage over places like England and Germany, where people with machine guns literally show up at your door if they don't like your social media post. Canada's pretty close behind, but I think America's pretty good on that.
I just want to say a word to you, Chen, and it sort of addresses your question as well, because you had mentioned about conspiracy theories of people perhaps who are influencers, who are perhaps not exactly coming at it from a traditional perspective, although they appear to be. I would agree with Father's characterization of Carrie Prejean-Boller, who is in fact a new Catholic. She's less Catholic, less than a year. Very knowledgeable for that fact, understanding about the truth of Zionism, the heresy of it, and also the horror of what's being done to the Catholics and Orthodox in the Holy Land, which the bishops of the Holy Land have been begging us to recognize for decades and decades, and all of our bishops, yours included, are silent, scandalously silent. The difficulty, and I don't know Candace that well, I know her husband, George, but I'll have to leave Candace aside because I don't watch her enough to formulate an opinion. But with regard to Nick Fuentes, while he talks a good game on various things, he also he's not a traditional Latin Mass Catholic, for one, and in fact seems to be sometimes against it. But then also, I think he's very dangerous. For one thing, the foul language that he uses is not appropriate for Catholics anyway. But for another, and much worse, is that he says, for instance, I don't care how gay you are, as long as you're loyal to me and dox people when I tell you to. That's very, very serious. He admits that he runs a personality cult and he's proud of it. So those things indicate to me this is not, there's not a reality there of someone who can be trusted as a traditional Catholic. And I say this myself as a sinner and not a traditional, well, I try to be a traditional Catholic, but you know, this is our situation is in the world today. It's very confusing. And so we have to be very, very careful to whom we give our trust.